So it's a pleasure for us to be presenting today, although we are very jet-lagged. But yeah, today's talk will be about scalable Bayesian inference in low-dimensional subspaces, and in particular, we will be discussing two papers. So the first one is Subspace Inference for Bayesian Deep Learning, which is a joint work with between BayesGroup and Wilson Lab, and the authors are Pavel, Wesley, me, Timur Gripov, Dmitry Petrovich Vetrov, and Andrew Golden Wilson. And this was published at UAI this year. And the second paper is projected DNNs from our colleagues at Harvard, and by Predier et al. From Finale Doshi Veles group. And for those of you who attended NeurIP's Bayesian Deep Learning workshop this year, it's this exact group who made this elbow video with Beyonce song. So, but it's not their greatest contribution to Bayesian Deep Learning area. But yeah, so these two papers share a higher level similar idea. And so yeah, let's begin by the common motivation and introduction to the talk. So in Bayesian approach, we want to infer a posterior distribution over models parameters. In full predictive posterior, we can potentially combine infinitely many models in our predictions, which would potentially lead to better predictions. And also we can incorporate, also we can represent uncertainty, which is very important for many downstream applications, such as medical applications. And moreover, we can incorporate some prior or domain knowledge into our prior distributions of the model's weights. However, to get all of these advantages out of Bayesian deep learning, we need to accurately estimate the posterior distribution, and it is quite challenging to do so for deep learning models, as the dimensionality of the problem is very high due to the fact that modern architectures have millions of parameters. So maybe one of the big challenges in Bayesian deep learning is approximating this high dimensional distribution and tackling the high dimensionality of the problem. So the shared idea between these two works is to learn low dimensional representation Z for our model's weights W, and then perform inference over these latent representations Z instead of the initial weights W. And further, during the test time, we can do Bayesian model averaging via sampling from our approximate posterior over Z, and then transforming back to the original weight space and averaging the models. So this part of the talk will be presented by Pavel, and this is our joint work on subspace inference for Bayesian deep learning.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Polina. So this part, is about our paper on subspace inference for Bayesian deep learning. And the motivation is we want, as Polina said, pretty much to try to capture the geometry of the posterior, but in a low-dimensional subspace. But the subspace will be constructed in some interesting way, so it won't be a random subspace, for example. And I'll first talk about two of our prior papers that are related to this idea. And the first one is mod connectivity. So the idea in that paper is that the local optima in neural nets are not isolated from each other. And for example, if you train the network twice from two different random initializations, you would get two different points in the weight space. And often people think of them as being isolated balls of the loss surface, but it turns out that there exist paths between them, such that along the path, the train loss and test error is almost constant. So you can travel between different local optima without leaving the region of good solutions. And the method we use to find this path is fairly simple and very similar to variational inference.
Прошу прощения, извините, пожалуйста, вы будете не видите, не видите, но внизу пишите. Все, да, скажи.
test.
Супер.
Okay. Yeah, so the method is very similar to variational inference, and the idea is that we parameterize the paths between the two local optima that we pre-trained, and this path is very simple. It can be a quadratic Bezier curve or a polygonal chain with one bend, and then we can this path is parameterized by something. So, for example, for this polygonal chain, it's parameterized by the position of this point. And then we can optimize for the position of this point by stochastic gradient descent. So the loss that we use is the integral of our original loss along the path. And we can compute stochastic gradients by just sampling a point on the path and then computing the gradient for the sample, but with respect to the parameters of the path. So this is very similar to what people do in VI. And the cool thing is that these paths, they lie in a two-dimensional subspace of the parameter space, so they're planar. And in particular, we can make these visualizations of the loss surface in the planes that contain the path. And we can see that there is this whole region of interesting solutions that we might want to ensemble or like do some kind of Bayesian inference over. So the idea, this was part of the motivation for the paper that I'm presenting today. We want to ensemble points from this two-dimensional subspace in some reasonable way. And what we'll do is we'll try to treat this loss surface as the density of our posterior distribution in this two-dimensional subspace, and we will be sampling from this distribution. So this is a high-level idea. But I also described the other paper, this SWA Gaussian, which was at this year's NeurIPS. And this is also a paper with Dmitry Petrovich, with Andrew Wilson, with Timur and Wesley. And the idea here is that the method is very simple. Again, we start by pre-training a solution, so that will start from a good region of the weight space, and then we run SGD with a high constant learning rate, and then we get these points here, and then we approximate the distribution of these points with the Gaussian distribution, and we use that as our approximation to the posterior. And then at test time, we can sample from this Gaussian, and we can compute predictions for each sample, and we can ensemble the predictions. So this is the whole procedure, and the idea is that this part of the trajectory will explore the region of good solutions, and then this approximation would provide a good local approximation to the posterior. And so here are the formulas. The interesting part is how we approximate the covariance matrix. So for the mean, it's just the average of those points, of these points that we got at this stage. So these points. And this is also known as SWA solution. So this is the average of the points that we get by running SGD with a high constant learning rate from a pre-trained solution. But for the covariance, we cannot, constructing the full dimensional covariances takes a lot of memory. So we use a low rank plus diagonal format. So the diagonal part is simple. It's just for each weight, we compute the variance of that weight in the trajectory. But we also have this low rank term, which is just the empirical covariance of the iterates. And it turns out that, we can think of this Gaussian approximation as having, at least for this term in the covariance, it only corresponds to variance in a subspace of the parameter space that has the same dimension as the rank of this matrix. So if we use 20 models, for example, for constructing this low rank part of the covariance, then the corresponding Gaussian would only have non-zero variance in a 20-dimensional subspace. We also have this diagonal term, but if we ignore it for now, then this is already a low-dimensional distribution. And it turns out that if we visualize the loss surface, or like the posterior density surface, in the corresponding subspace, the subspace that corresponds to the SGD trajectory, then SWAG kind of captures the geometry of the posterior in the subspace.
And can you comment on the shape of trajectory in this subspace?
Yeah, it's so the trajectory is shown with this line here and this line here. And yeah, it looks interesting, but it's an artifact of how we construct the subspace. The subspace is the PCA of that trajectory. And even if you, for example, do a random walk, and then you do a PCA of it, and you project it on the first two components, then it would look, actually, I think, similar to this. So,
So the trajectory is this curve, actually.
Yeah. And so, yeah. So
it's very consequence of the law of large numbers, or central theory.
Yeah.
But quite unusual.
But yeah, it's interesting how it looks and like how it looks in this. This is, by the way, this is the first two principal components of the SGD trajectory, and this is components 3 and 4. And the dashed line shows our swag approximation to the posterior, and the plot itself is showing the density of the posterior, or the equivalent is the loss in this two-dimensional subspace. And we can see that the variances of the swag approximation are more or less aligned with the widths of the posterior. So, for example, here we see that the posterior is wide in this direction and narrow in this direction, and our swag approximation is also wide in the first direction and narrow in the second direction. And this trend keeps if we look at, for example, components 10 and 11 and so on. So it's not just the first 4. Yeah.
I would say we can say that the proportions of variances with respect to different dimensions are more or less correlated with the proportions of the loss function.
Yeah, yeah.
But not the scale directly.
There is a scaling thing. Yeah, you can. From this plot, we can.
It's not clear whether the scale is good or not.
Yeah, it's not clear from this plot. Yeah. Okay, so. But you can also notice that here, for example, along the first component, the swag approximation is wider than we would probably want it to be. So this ellipse is more like is more narrow than we would want it to be. So, and we can have an alternative method that would just try to directly approximate this distribution corresponding to this loss function directly in this low-dimensional subspace. And that's again kind of the idea of the method that we propose in this subspace inference paper. So,
I have a question. So previously you have shown the 3D picture of loss landscape where there is a curved valley between the two modes. And now you have shown us unimodal distributions which don't look that fancy. So what's the connection between the two? Shouldn't we be seeing something less convex more clearly?
So both of these are actually like real loss landscapes of the same network on the same dataset, but it depends on the subspace that you pick to visualize the loss surface. So this is a specific subspace that is constructed using this method, and this is the subspace that corresponds to the PCA directions of the SGD trajectory. So, and for example, if you look in random directions, it would also look very boring. It would look like less boring than this actually, but still a unimodal, like pretty much convex shape.
So why is this interesting then?
It's, I mean, what do you mean by interesting? Like,
why should we care? Previously you have shown us the valley, where the valley that contains a lot of different, well, probably a couple of different solutions.
So with
see a single mode.
So with the subspace inference method, we can do both of this. So we will actually look at what happens if you do inference in this subspace and what happens if you do inference in this subspace, and we'll see what the results are in each case. So we care about this because this is almost free to construct, while constructing this subspace, it has more interesting solutions, but it's more expensive to construct. So if we care about how long the whole method would take to run, then we might care more about the PCA of SGD trajectory. Yeah.
I have another question about integration. So on the left plot here, we did see that this LWA Gaussian looks too wide. Yeah. But maybe it is not a bad thing. So I think one of the reasons that LWA actually works is because it avoids overfitting by pushing this point not right at the minima of the training loss, but at some point where the training loss is wider. So maybe if we sample like from the training loss directly, we will go to this bad local optima, like this red point on the plot, and would perform much worse on the test set.
Yeah, it could be, but I guess at least from the Bayesian perspective, we would want to have the right distribution that would have higher density in this part, but still like some density in this part, and it would at least be aligned with like the shape of the posterior. So I guess it could be that maybe this distribution for like our end goals, the ensembling of samples, maybe this distribution is better, but at least like if we are trying to somehow represent the posterior, then it seems better to if our distribution was aligned. And also the spec distribution appears aligned in all the other PCA directions, and only the first one is not aligned. So I guess it was just one of the things that motivated us to try to do something different in the subspace. Yeah. So yeah, finally the subspace inference method. And here there are just three parts to the method. First, will construct a subspace of the parameter space that would be ideally, the subspace should be interesting and should contain many different good solutions. And then after we will try to sample or construct an approximation to the posterior distribution in the subspace. And then at test time we sample from this posterior distribution and we do Bayesian model averaging. So, and yeah, the cool thing is that even for like modern, very large neural networks, we can do this, and we can, even using like a very low dimensional subspace, maybe 5-dimensional subspace, we can get something useful in terms of better uncertainties and better predictions compared to like the SGD solution. And so first we will need to choose a subspace, and in our paper we are only doing linear subspaces, or affine subspaces. So we have a shift vector W hat, and then we have some basis vectors D1, Dk that are the basis of our subspace, and then we parameterize the subspace with this variables T1, Tk. So for every setting of these T's, we have a corresponding point in the subspace and a corresponding point in the original weight space. And we can define the likelihood distribution for the parameters T as follows. So we take the corresponding point in the original parameter space, and we evaluate the likelihood for that point. And we use that as the likelihood for the low dimensional vector T. And then if we also define a prior over this parameter C, in some way we can compute the posterior. And this is not like, we are not actually trying to, now we are just completely using a new model instead of our original neural network. So we are not saying that this is, I guess, like trying to approximate the posterior for the original neural network. We just think of it as just having a new model with parameters T, and we are trying to do inferences in this new model. Yeah, and at inference time, we'll just sample from our approximate, or like our posterior or approximate posterior over the parameter C, and we'll ensemble the corresponding points, corresponding neural networks. And yeah, so another cool thing about this approach is that we can use methods that we usually cannot use for neural nets. So, for example, we can use this variational inference with very expressive families of variational distributions because it's a very low dimensional subspace. Here we can actually do almost exact inference and use very fancy approximations. And we can also use advanced Monte Carlo methods like Hamiltonian Monte Carlo or no U-turn sampler or this elliptical slice sampling. And they all work fairly fast in this subspace.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you use your prior over T to induce some fancy properties, or just take whatever?
Here we only use a Gaussian prior as like standard Gaussian, centered at 0 and with variance 1. So not.
As to why it might be interesting to choose other options?
So I guess for us, here the subspace already is constructed in a way that many points in the subspace are interesting, and it's just like hard to come up with a better prior, I guess, than this. But
wouldn't Bayes prior induce a prior over these parameters T?
yeah. I mean, we can think of this prior that we are using as it's not a very meaningful prior, I guess. In the prior is centered as the SWA solution. Would be centered as the SWA solution. So it's like data dependent in a sense. But if we have a full space prior in the weight space, then we can think of the corresponding prior over T, I guess.
Yeah, but I mean, if you marginalize over T and get the prior or effective prior over the weights,
Yeah. Yeah.
Everything is degenerate in this model because we're working in a lower dimensional subspace.
Yeah.
Like, that's why we are sort of redefining the likelihood for the model so that the model is restricted to live in the subspace.
Yeah, like it is the hypothesis by just adding some very small noise. And after that, so it is no longer degenerate. But yeah, it's a bit sketchy.
But also, I guess, so you said initially that if we have a prior in the full space, it corresponds to a prior in this space, right? In the space of T. So I guess that might not be true, because like restricting a distribution to a measure zero subset is not well defined. So there is some problem with that, some paradox in probability theory. So you cannot, like we cannot, for example, if we have our full posterior, we cannot compute the posterior conditioned on being in, like on the points lying in a subspace. So it's not well defined.
Why not?
Because if you parameterize the same subspace in different ways, you get different distributions. So,
Oh,
yeah.
Could
right,
you
okay, but it would depend on the scaling of P, right?
Here, what would depend?
Like you would only get different distributions if the scaling like of the matrix P would be different. So it is not basically the same subspace, it's changing the space.
If you, I mean, yeah, but also if you use like a non-linear parameterization, like you use this polar coordinates in the subspace, for example, you will get a different distribution.
Yeah,
So,
but you can say the same things about like the full weight space.
But then-
And the prior would change. So,
in the full space, like you can compute the correspond, like the distribution doesn't change over if you change the parameterization, right? Like you also have this Jacobian determinant. So you can go from one parameterization to the other without like changing the distribution. But here, if you just parameterize the same subspace, so I mean, you have a fixed subspace, which is like a set of points, right? And then you compute the distribution for one parameterization of the subspace, and then you try to change the parameterization, so you get a new distribution, and it wouldn't be the same as if you originally tried to do this procedure for the second parameterization.
But that's quite strange, because in both cases there's a clear geometric sense.
Yeah, but
They intersect the same distribution with the same hyperplane with the same nonlinear manifold of all dimensions.
yeah,
So we should obtain the same distribution at the intersection. No?
yeah, but it doesn't work.
The problem is in the zero measure, yes?
Yeah, yeah,
Conditioning on the zero measure.
Okay.
yeah.
But it still contradicts to my geometric intuition. Okay, we'll discuss it
Mhm.
later on. Could you tell in a couple of words what is the no U-turn sampler?
Actually, I don't know like a lot, but it's something like
CMC samplers.
it's something like HMC, Hamiltonian Monte Carlo, but with some automatic tuning of the parameters that ensures that it's like you don't have to tune these parameters of HMC, and this is the mess. And it's like, I guess, easier to apply than HMC, and it's used in physics as far as I know. So, yeah, now this part, the temperature. This is somewhat controversial. So, because we have this low-dimensional subspace, we only have pretty much 5 parameters of in our that we are trying to do inference or like 20. So the dimension of the subspace is the number of parameters that we try to do inference over. But we have 50,000 data points. So if it's CFAR, and if we have 50,000 data points and only 5 parameters, then the posterior would almost collapse. So if you try to just directly sample from the posterior over these t variables, then you would get pretty much just one point or things that are very close to the same point. And this won't be a useful procedure for uncertainty estimation, for example.
We have seen like this curve where several points,
So, I mean, it's not completely flat, right? So for even the points on the endpoints, this is 0.34 loss, this is 0.36 loss. And if you have 50,000 observations, then your posterior would almost concentrate on just this point. So this would have very low posterior density compared to this.
This is because we go to another subspace. So here it doesn't look like one mode is.
So this is the logarithm of the density, right? And
this is not the logarithm of the posterior. This is logarithm of likelihood, I guess.
Yeah.
And the effect is caused by the fact that the amount of data is much larger than the amount of parameters to be estimated. Mm-hmm. And then our posterior solution collapses to delta function.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's like, in general, in Bayesian inference, if we have, like, as the number of data increases, the posterior should often collapses to just the maximum likelihood solution. And here in neural nets, we usually have like much more parameters and data points, and there the posterior does not collapse at all. But here, because we go to this very low dimensional model, we actually observe this collapse, and to the extent that it's just not useful if we don't do anything about it. So what we ended up doing is this temperature scaling. So, and
the most ugly part.
Yeah. So it's a bit unfortunate that we had to do it, but we had to. And the idea is actually like a known trick that you just rescale, like apply this power to your likelihood term, and your prior remains unchanged. But so here this is known as temperature. So if temperature goes to infinity, this would be, the posterior would go to prior, be very similar to prior. And if t goes to 0, then temperature goes to 0, then we would get like total collapse to just the maximum likelihood solution. And yeah, so, and this t controls the degree to which we observe collapse of the posterior. And usually we have...
Alternatively, it controls the trade-off between the amount of data and the amount of parameters.
Yes.
In some sense.
Yeah. And yeah, so we have to tune it in some way, and we do this on the validation. But it, like in terms of the final performance, there is a range of values usually that perform reasonably well. And a reasonable heuristic to start at least cross-validation with is this setting the temperature to number of data points over the number of parameters.
Number of parameters in initial neural net.
No, in this subspace. So then this would mean that like the contributions of likelihood and prior are the same as if we had the same number of data points as parameters.
Yeah.
So that's yeah, that's the idea for that heuristic. But in general,
formally speaking, we can apply it to the situation when we do not work with low-dimensional spaces.
Yeah, yeah.
Have you tried it?
Like applying it in the original parameter space.
I'm quite interested in what would happen there.
I don't know. So, for example,
if we apply this heuristic for dimensional space and use just standard variational inference with a fully factorized Gaussian,
yeah.
for example.
So that would mean dividing the KL term by I don't know how many parameters, let's say 1 million parameters and like a 50,000 data points.
That would prevent us from prevent KL term from dominating and from variation.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, as far as I know in VI, we also usually divide KL by something, maybe 6. And
what about 7?
And that's also can be actually can be thought of as temperature scaling. And in Monte Carlo, for example, in SGLD, people often divide the variance in the noise term in the gradients by something, and that's also Yeah, and that's also temperature scaling. So this is also done to a degree in other approximate Bayesian inference methods.
Can you include somehow this tempering into your prior?
Into the prior. I don't think so, no. Yeah, because, well, maybe. If our prior, yeah, I don't, how exactly would you do that?
Like the question does it correspond to rescaling the prior in some way? I guess so.
No. The problem is not the prior. The problem is the scale of the likelihood. So basically, by changing the prior, you can change the relative magnitude of the likelihood and the prior, but the problem is not that the likelihood dominates the prior or that the prior dominates the likelihood. The problem is just that the posterior resultant posterior is just too concentrated.
Yeah.
And you need to change the temperature of the whole posterior distribution. So you could, for example, like include the prior term under this power as well. So it is not like the issue with the prior.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's talk about which subspaces we can use for this procedure, and we actually already listed two of them, and but not this one. This one is the simplest thing you can do, and it's just like using random directions for your subspace. And we'll be showing these plots. So these are, we use some one-dimensional regression synthetic dataset to visualize the uncertainties. And here the red points are showing the data points that we have, and this thick blue curve is showing the mean of the predictive distribution, and the lighter blue region is the predictive uncertainties. And what we want to see here is we want, in between the data points, we want the uncertainty to be high, and near the data points, we want the uncertainty to be low. Because near the data points, I guess it makes sense. So, yeah, so, and for this random subspace, we do not see this behavior because we can see that the uncertainty is almost uniform in the domain, and that's not the uncertainty that we want.
Isn't it the problem with the temperature? Like from the plot on the right, it seems like we underestimate the variances.
I mean, it depends on the color, like how we, the color map, right? But just rescaling the temperature usually almost just rescales the uncertainty. So it's, here at least the distribution that we get is almost spherical. And yeah, I guess it would be better in this plot if we had another at least value of the, like a different color for some lower value. Because here it doesn't seem like the samples follow the shape of the posterior, but yeah. So here at least, like we tried different values of the temperature, and usually the uncertainties that we get does not look great on this synthetic problem. And this is the next subspace, the PCA subspace of SGD trajectory. So this is the same subspace that related to swag that we discussed in the beginning. And here you can see that we do actually observe this behavior, that away from the data points, we get high uncertainty, and near the data points, we get low uncertainty. And so that's what we want. Yeah, and then the last subspace is the curve subspace. And here we see this behavior, also see this behavior. But it's actually maybe not super clear in these plots, but this subspace is usually doing better in terms of this behavior. Here we see more of this difference between uncertainty near and away from the data. But as I said, there is a trade-off. So this subspace is very cheap to construct. This subspace is completely free to construct. This subspace is cheap to construct because we only have to run SGD for maybe like 20 extra epochs. And this subspace is very expensive to construct because we first have to pre-train the two local optima, and then we also have to train the curve between them. So this subspace takes maybe like 3 times more than standard training. And this was supposed to be a GIF, but it doesn't show here, so let's skip it. And now Polina will, right? Polina will talk about different subspaces.
можете поменьше сделать, можно?
Straight. Okay, so like pretty much Pavel already summarized the comparison between the three subspaces that we looked into. And we generally see this behavior that the richer subspaces lead to better predictions and like more diversity in the model, in the models in the function space, and thus like better uncertainty representation. And like across different experiments, we observed that this curve subspace performs better in terms of negative log likelihood and calibration, and then the PCA subspace was sort of some kind of a trade-off between the computational complexity for constructing the subspace and the quality of predictions. And yeah, here we are showing this log density plots for the posterior as well as the uncertainty on this regression problem. And yeah, the following few slides will be just comparing how different approximate inference methods perform in the subspaces, and this is quite interesting because so like this slide shows how VI does for random subspace, PCA subspace, and curve subspace, and we see that actually for the curve subspace, which has very interesting non-Gaussian geometry, we cannot like capture it with fully factorized Gaussian, and it just collapses to one of the solutions, or like from a different initialization, it could collapse to this point, which has like also very high likelihood, but not like sort of capture the whole structure of the subspace. And that's like, so the PCA subspace with VI showed like pretty reasonable performance, but unlike curve subspace, which was usually better with other inference techniques. So this is mean field VI. Yeah. This is real MVP VI. So we were hoping that maybe if we use a more expressive prior, then we could get maybe a better approximated posterior. And so for the PCA subspace, again, we observed that it was working reasonably well over, although like underestimating some of the extrapolation uncertainty. But for curve subspaces, although it's like a very simple 2D problem, it was still very hard to tune real MVP to approximate this distribution, which was quite surprising. So like in this run, it was not capturing like the whole curve, although like it still was better than just Gaussian VI. So, but like I assume that if we spent more time tuning the real MVP parameters, maybe we could like capture the whole shape. But actually, the easier way to get that, to capture all of the diversity in this geometry of the subspace was by running this MCMC NUTS sampler, and it very well explores this posterior in both curve and PCA subspaces. So this was like a very nice, results for this MCMC method. And this is also some variant of MCMC with elliptical slice sampling, which also performed very, very well in this interesting subspaces.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
So could you provide more insight into like this MCMC method? So you do, so these are still stochastic gradient MCMC gradient methods?
Yes.
No.
What?
ESS doesn't use any gradient at all. ESS is not gradient based.
Yeah.
NUTS uses NUTS.
Wait.
Might not be using stochastic gradient, like full gradient.
Mm-hmm. So how many epochs do you need to obtain these points?
So ESS was actually very quick. It's like ESS compared to VI was almost the same in terms of the time complexity. So maybe
Like 50 epochs.
or less. Yeah, I don't remember. Not much. So maybe 10 to 50. And NUTS was slow, especially. So we used NUTS from the Pyro.
Yeah.
And that was very slow for some reason. So we actually only used NUTS on the synthetic problem, and then on the image classification we used
ESS only.
Mm-hmm.
And I have one question.
Mm-hmm.
Could you please return to the previous slide? Yeah. So here the picture in the middle, the upper middle picture.
Upper, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a pair-like figure.
Mm-hmm.
Why the scale is so different on x and y axis in comparison with the left hand and the right hand pictures? Is it because we have different scale for PCA space?
So for
the random space and with the curve space.
Like for the curve subspace, these are like these 2 points here are 2 different solutions that we got from like independently training networks. They were like inherently further away in the weight space, right?
Okay.
For the random subspace,
yeah.
I'm trying to see that. So for the random,
distance, or is it in different scale? Because if it's in the same scale, then the middle picture is seems to be like some extra sharp.
So these seems to be like a more narrow scale than the random subspace,
yeah.
and basically it is related to the fact that if we look at the width of the PCA directions and compare them to just random directions, then and if we plot them on just one graph, then maybe like the first few PCA directions will be very sharp, and then like the 40th direction will be very wide, but the random ones will be like somewhat in between. So they will be much wider than the first 2 principal components, which are shown here on this middle plot.
Okay, then I will plot a picture and ask you a question. If we have a marker, of course.
We didn't find one, but
I have. Good. Because this is a question which will causes my interest for some time. So assume that we have the following loss landscape. So very narrow here, very wide middle here. And we start somewhere here and run SGD.
Yeah.
So what will be the typical shape of the trajectory?
Actually,
Will it be some oscillations here, or will it be some oscillations here?
if it's SGD, it also
There.
depends a lot. Like for a quadratic
No,
loss,
for
you can
for example, yeah.
you can just derive almost what the stationary distribution would be. It depends on the noise and the gradients. If the noise is isotropic Gaussian, so you just add spherical Gaussian, then the stationary distribution of SGD will follow the shape. It will just like follow the shape. The learning rate defines the scale of this, but if it's in general, it will just have the same contours as the loss that you apply.
But if so, then we take all these points from the trajectory and run PC, right?
Yeah.
So when then the first principal component should correspond to the direction where the minimum is wide, not sharp.
So actually, yeah. So actually, for the image classification problems, we had this picture. So the first principal components are the widest. So
I said the opposite.
yeah.
Okay.
So
This is why I asked,
yeah.
because I have arguments for both sides.
So this is the first principal component. This is the loss, just one-dimensional cross-section of the loss. This is the first principal component. This is the second, and then they just become narrower and narrower. This would be like B20, and a random ray would be like a random direction would be somewhere in between.
So it's the opposite of what I said,
Yeah,
but it's
here
because I'm too sleepy. Yeah.
Here we see different behavior. That might be due to so at least this plot was in the SVAG paper, and this was made for
Like CFAR classification.
Yeah, we can look at this plot. Do we see the same thing here? So here we see different behavior. So I think it's depends on the architecture that you use, the kind of pictures that you see, like the scales of the two. So for some reason, for this problem, maybe there was a problem with the scale. I'm actually not sure.
This was my first hypothesis.
Yeah.
But is the problem with the scale, or the scale is the same?
I thought it's the same, but
But here we see that this looks like a very, very sharp minimum.
Mm-hmm.
in comparison with the minimum here, which is obtained with the intersection
Random
of the random
size.
plane. Yeah. And that's a bit strange.
We should probably double check. It's could be either that scales are changed for some reason when we made the plots, or that it just depends on the architecture that you use. So
And the problem.
yes, like maybe for some reason for this one-dimensional regression architecture, the random array is much wider than even the y directions of LGD, because like yes, this behavior happens if you have a quadratic loss function, but it doesn't really maybe different for a particular neural network architecture. Might not just for this 20 epochs that we run this SGD trajectory for, maybe we just don't travel much along the very wide directions, and we wouldn't do PCA, we wouldn't see. We just wouldn't have any very.
Yes. This is the argument for the quantity set, because we can, for example, make the following derivation. We say that here the slope is very small.
Yeah.
Here the slope is sharp. So if we are somewhere here, we have a strong gradient which directed here plus some noise.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have fluctuations in this direction, and we have very small drift in this direction. And then if we run PCA, then the first principal component will be this one.
But in 2 dimensions, we would actually see what I said, this behavior. But in high dimensions, we probably would see a mixture of both. So among many directions, we would just not move at all. So because if we only do 10,000 steps in 10 million dimensions.
That's clear,
yeah.
Of course. But anyway, it's still not 100% clear what's happening and what is the behavior with respect to the largest eigenvector.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we need to form some more intuition and more understanding of what's happening.
In 2D or in?
No,
In higher.
in higher dimensions, of course.
Yeah. Do you use the same points between these first two plots, or these are different points?
Yeah, this is the same local, we are constructing the subspace around the same solution.
So did you try looking not into the top 2 or 10 eigenvectors, but the last 10 eigenvectors? What would happen if you leave the spectrum upside down?
Yeah.
Mm.
I think we tried, but I'm not sure.
Would it work better than the random subspace, or would it be the same as the random subspace? Would it be the same as the PCA subspace that you use? What is the behavior there?
I don't think we looked at the
But what would you say?
top
I
list.
think that it's more or less clear that it should be like a random.
This is one of the possible hypotheses, but we can clearly see from the plots
Yeah, at the same time they are sharper, right? They are sharper than random.
The random directions are different from the smallest and the largest eigenvectors.
Yeah, I guess we should just try it. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
And for me, it was always puzzling. Which direction should you use? The most wide or the most sharp? Which is not clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for in terms of image classification experiments, we also observed the same behavior, that the curve subspace is the most diverse one, and it has it leads to better predictions and better uncertainty in terms of negative log likelihood and accuracy. And these are some UCI experiments, and this is log likelihood for some of the data sets in UCI regression. And for most experiments, the subspace performs the PCA subspace together with ESS sampler performs comparable or better than previous methods.
What is DVI?
Deterministic VI, yeah. And so, yeah, this is UCI regression with fully connected neural network. I do not remember the exact architecture. I think we used something like 1 or 2 hidden layers for the architecture.
All of the setup of DVI.
Yeah, we sort of compared mostly against DVI, which was the state of the art at last year's iClear, I think.
Do you have like aggregated numbers, because the performance looks like very similar to DBI? Sometimes DBI is better, sometimes DBI is worse.
We have like a lot of experiments, both for negative log likelihood and like 95% credible set coverage in the paper, but it was like very hard to compress it into one slide. But yeah, it was, so like these, all of these experiments, UCI regression, they are very small data sets, and like depending on the random split, it like there is the variance is like so large, so it's sometimes like very hard to say what performs better than what. But I mean, we get some reasonable numbers, and like calibration with 95% coverage was like also working pretty well.
I guess just quickly, one thing, it's cool that this DBI only works for this one-layer networks, and we can actually run the same method, our method.
Yeah, for CNNs and
we get at least as good.
Yeah. Yeah. So like for the summary of this paper, we can apply many standard approximate inference techniques in very low dimensional subspaces and get a good uncertainty representation. And so like maybe the biggest takeaway of this paper is that the subspace choice matters a lot, and like the more diverse subspace we use for approximate inference, the better results we can get. And PCA was like a good trade-off that we suggested between the computational cost and performance. And in general, like subspace inference in the PCA subspace was competitive or better with like many prior works. Yeah, so like at this point we will switch to the second part. And it's going to be this paper from Harvard, and it's called Projected DNNs. And the biggest difference with subspace inference is that their goal is to learn nonlinear representations, nonlinear subspace of the weights, and also not only represent uncertainty over these lower dimensional representations, but also over the subspace that we learn, over these parameters of the nonlinear function that maps from the latent representations back into original weight space. And in their work, they only use variational inference for learning these representations. So they're optimizing variational lower bound with respect to subspace parameters and latent representations. And now I'll go into more details of the model. So this is the generative model that they assume for the neural network. There is some latent representation Z that is somehow capturing interesting structure of the weights, and there is parameters phi of the function that will be mapping from the latent representation Z into the higher dimensional weights W. And once we sample Z and phi, we will use a deterministic function G to get our weights W, and then we can use these weights in a neural network to either do classification or regression. And the goal of the work is to like approximate this posterior distribution jointly for latent representations Z and parameters phi of the decoder from latent space to the original weight space.
Is the decoder just a neural network?
Yes, it's a neural network.
So basically they mapping like from some small dimensional space to million dimensional space.
Huge space, yeah.
Say again?
The space of W is huge.
Yeah.
So it's not clear how to construct such kind of neural network, whose output.
I guess.
Well, we will move to the experiments in a few slides, and we'll see that they have some results for smaller neural networks, and they don't really show any experiments on like image data sets and crazy big networks. So.
Paper from Uber, I guess, and they did exactly the same thing but filter-wise. Filters are really big, and you can learn kind of latent representations for filters.
Is it that intrinsic dimensionality?
It's been around, yeah.
I was saying, is it intrinsic dimensionality paper?
It's another paper.
Okay.
I can tell you.
My my mind was with another paper that I saw like a couple of years ago, where they basically took a huge neural network, like millions of weights, run SGLD, and then tried to they obtained a set of the weights and then put them into again. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the paper. So basically, this looks very similar, but instead of again, you do variational.
Yeah, but like
Okay,
maybe.
okay. Let's continue.
Yeah, it's not a variational autoencoder. It's just an auto. It's not even an autoencoder actually, but yeah, we'll see further. So this is like the function that maps from Z to W, and it has some parameters phi for which we are also doing posterior approximation. Okay, so yeah, we assume the mean field approximation for Z and phi, which will factorize. So we'll be separately approximating the with the normal approximation the posterior over Z, and we'll use also normal posterior approximation for our parameters of the this subspace function. And the training objective will be just a variational lower bound with two KL terms, which are corresponding to latent representation Z and parameters phi. But so the authors encountered some problems with numerical or just stability problems when like training this objective, because they were like jointly optimizing for uncertainty in Z and in phi, and somehow that wasn't working well. And the fix that they suggested is to use a good initialization for phi. So in particular, they wanted this decoder phi to be biased to produce well-performing weights in terms of like neural network function space. So the particular method they used was collecting some good performing weights using fast geometric ensembling. I will shortly describe what that is. And then they wanted to learn a point estimate for this projection function, which maps from Z to W. And the fast geometric ensembling is the following procedure that was suggested in the Curve mode connectivity paper. And so basically we are pre-training the network for roughly 75% of the training budget, and then we use the cyclical learning rate when we increase and decrease the learning rate values, and then we collect the points that correspond to the lowest value for learning rates. And if we look at the test error plot, which is aligned to this learning rate values, this will be points of the highest performing neural networks, but they will be different high performing solutions, and so we will be ensembling these well performing points. And so like the procedure that they do is to collect these FGE snapshots and then learn an autoencoder to reconstruct these W's through this function G, through the composition of functions G and F, F and G, and then we will only use the weights that we learned in the decoder to initialize our variational approximation when we use the when we are training the posterior approximation. And but they not only wanted to this autoencoder to be good at reconstructing the weights that were corresponding to FGE, but also they cared about the discriminative loss that was corresponding to these weights that were produced by autoencoder. So, like, this is their method that they named the prediction constrained autoencoder, and this is basically just used for good preconditioning of the VI for subspace, nonlinear subspace. And as I said already, they collect FGE weights, and then they optimize this function where the first term is just the reconstruction loss from FGE weights and the autoencoder reconstructed FGE weights, and the second term is the how well this reconstructed points behave for this particular task that we are optimizing for at the end of the day. And after they train this loss, they will obtain some phi star, which will be initialization point for the mean field approximation for the approximate inference over phi. And then they initialize the variational inference over z randomly, which I personally was wondering why they do that, because the initialization for phi was like specifically constructed for reconstructing FGE snapshots. So it would make a lot of sense to actually at least initialize this latent space also with some learned representations for the FGE snapshots. But anyway, in their method, they just used random initialization for parameters over z. And yeah, this is just the summary of their method. They first do this pre-training for the autoencoder, and they use this parameters phi to initialize the variational inference, and then they optimize variational lower bound with respect to the parameters, variational parameters, and they obtain some posterior approximation. And so the results that they showed in the paper are mostly like non-large scale results. So they showed some synthetic regression, and then some specifically like crafted example for showing the interesting geometric properties of their method, as well as some UCI regression results, but not any large scale image classification. So yeah, this is the synthetic regression problem, and they showed that the projected BNN method works better in uncertainty, in between data uncertainty estimation than Bayes by backprop and mean VI with normalizing flows and some other structured VI method. And yeah, so their method outperforms this other counterparts in terms of uncertainty. And this is the experiment that they specifically construct to show how they are able to capture multimodal posterior. So on the left bottom plot with the black dots, they're showing the data that they generated. And this data has basically 4 modes. But the network that they're using is really expressive network with 1 hidden layer and 3 units in the hidden layer. So this 3 hidden units neural network can only capture 3 modes of the posterior. And they show it with like running this extremely huge network from different initializations. And so these blue and red curves are like the learned function from different initializations, and they all are only able to capture 3 modes. So when they also like collect these independently trained weights, and then they run, they look at the PCA, first PCA component, and they see that there are basically 2 modes in the weights that can be learned by this neural network. And so they test for this problem how their projected neural network versus simple Bayes by backprop or VI compare. And so it's shown here that the VI can only capture 1 mode. So we can see at this plot that it only captured like these 2 modes, and like this, the left 2 modes are approximated with sort of 1 mode, and this only corresponds to capturing this right mode at the weight space. Versus their method, which was sort of able to capture all of the 4 modes, and we can see like larger diversity in between these 2 modes. Yeah, so this is like the geometric demonstration for.
What was the dimensionality of latent space? Because as far as I can see, the number of weights in such a neural network was extremely small.
Yeah, so it was. It was how many weights in the neural network?
Well,
I guess
1 input, 1 output, and 3 hidden neurons.
Yeah. So 6 weights.
Okay, plus bias.
So what was the dimension of latent space?
I actually don't remember. I think it was something like 2 or 3.
Yeah.
Wait, but like like the top right picture is actually very bad. Like it is not useful uncertainty between these 2 points. The best solution would be actually like the top left picture, right?
The top left picture is non-Bayesian. Maybe it's the best solution. But the point here is to like, these are just PCA projection of the randomly trained neural networks. So we like randomly.
As a ground truth.
Yeah, like kind of ground truth.
Like, because I don't think that the top right picture is there because it is Bayesian. It's just because they cannot like jump from one mode to another in a discrete fashion. They need to be continuous.
Right.
So they need to interpolate between those modes. And in this problem, I'm not sure whether this is particularly useful.
Well, in function space, we can see that like their approximation is quite reasonable.
Yeah.
It kind of captures like both peaks here and both peaks here. Maybe like not perfectly on this one, but like their point is basically that it's better than the left one, and that it can kind of potentially capture like bimodal or like multimodal distributions through this like nonlinear projection of the weights.
Am I right that the right top picture can be caused by the fast sample method?
FG?
Yeah.
Mm.
They average the weights. It seems that this can be feasible.
But fast geometric ensemble is not averaging weights in any way. So fast geometric ensembling is just collecting the snapshots using this like learning weight schedule, and then they just like pre-train this autoencoder, nonlinear autoencoder to.
You're not generating new weights given these collected weights. You use just the collected weights, or you.
Yeah, they just use like collected FG samples to pre-train the autoencoder.
That's maybe like just an answer to, I guess, Arsene. So these are like not samples from the posterior, right? These are different map solutions pretty much. So we don't, maybe this is a reasonable, maybe these are reasonable samples from the posterior. So it's at least not clear.
Yeah, this is not true posterior. These are like, yeah, as I said, independently trained map solutions. All right, and then they have like, this is some partial results of what they had for UCI regression, and maybe like the interesting part here is that they did this ablation study for their model projected BNN, and they compared learning the uncertainty only in the latent space rather than the autoencoder, and also the linear versus nonlinear autoencoder, and they sort of pretty much looked at all the variants, and the conclusion is that their version is like better, and this one-stage model was using a random initialization for the autoencoder, so it was like without the smart FGE biased initialization for the subspace. And yeah, the takeaway for this work is that they can capture multiple modes of the posterior potentially, and that they, using the VI in the latent space rather than in the full dimensional weight space, they can capture some nonlinear correlations in the weights, and but like from their disadvantages, it seems to be harder to scale to large problems and large architectures, because we would need to learn this autoencoder mapping from a very, very high dimensional, million dimensional space into some like lower dimensional space. And yeah, so the summary for everything is that we can use geometric properties of the posterior or loss functions to learn linear or nonlinear subspaces of the weights and perform Bayesian inference in this smaller dimensional space. And even with this very low dimensional subspaces, we can get some useful results and significant improvements in uncertainty estimation. And maybe the biggest takeaway is that the richer subspaces translate to better performance. And yeah, I guess maybe an open question how to like automatically find this subspaces that lead to better uncertainty estimates, especially useful for Bayesian model averaging. Yeah, and that's all for today.
Okay, thank you.